Dan Trachtenberg's Predator Badlands operates on a deceptively simple premise. A young predator must hunt a dangerous creature on an alien world to prove his worth to his father. Everything the film does flows directly from the single, uncomplicated objective. There are no secondary plots demanding attention, no elaborate mythology being built, no universe-expanding consequences hanging over the narrative. It's almost shocking how confidently a $105 million studio picture can ignore the compulsion to overcomplicate itself. The film's genius, and occasionally its limitation, lies in its refusal to mistake scale for complexity. When Dek crash lands on Jenna, the planet becomes his entire world. The scope is deliberately claustrophobic. He meets Thea, a Weyland-Yutani synthetic played by Elle Fanning, whose legs have been severed, and she offers him assistance in tracking the Callisk in exchange for reuniting her with her missing appendages. This is the film's emotional and narrative spine, two damaged beings helping each other survive. What's immediately striking is how little the film asks of its audience in terms of plot infrastructure. There's no elaborate exposition dump explaining predator culture or the significance of the hunt. Dek wants to prove himself, his father demands proof through the hunt, the Callisk represents the proof. The script, written by Patrick Asun from a story by Dan Trachtenberg and Asun, trusts the framework entirely. It doesn't pad the margins with intrigue or complication. When Dek and Thea travel across the landscape looking for their quarry, the film simply shows them traveling. When they encounter obstacles, they overcome them in order. There's no twisting revelation that complicates their mission or a hidden agenda that recontextualizes their relationship. This sounds reductive on paper. In practice, it allows something unusual to emerge. Genuine character interaction without the machinery of a plot constantly shuffling them around. The dialogue between Dek and Thea is often slight, sometimes deliberately obtuse in its buddy comedy rhythms. Thea observes something Dek does and notes it as unusual. Dek attempts what might be humor and Thea responds with literal incomprehension. Was that a joke? The beat doesn't land as a laugh line, it exists to establish their fundamental difference and somehow their compatibility. She's missing context for his behavior. He's learning to exist outside the rigid hierarchy of his species. They're both exiles discovering that survival requires adaptation. The film could easily have weaponized this dynamic for broader comedic effect. A script with less confidence might have Thea gradually getting jokes, marking her emotional growth through humor comprehension. Instead, Badlands lets the awkwardness breathe. These moments feel genuinely unresolved in a way that modern screenwriting typically avoids. The simplicity of the exchange, the flatness of Thea's observation, becomes the point. This isn't a formula movie pretending to be simple. It's a simple movie that trusts its own restraint. And what develops between these two characters is companionship born from necessity, then deepened by something neither quite intends. Elle Fanning, cast across two roles as both Thea and her antagonistic synthetic sister Tessa, brings a particular kind of vulnerability to Thea. She's strapped to Dek's back for most of the journey, literally dependent on him, and Fanning plays this vulnerability without melodrama. When Dek agrees to help her retrieve her severed legs, he's making a choice that prioritizes her welfare over his mission timeline. It's a small gesture that registers as profound, precisely because the film doesn't underscore it emotionally. No swelling score, no meaningful camera work, it simply happens. The introduction of Bud, a creature on Jenna that Thea names and that becomes integral to their survival, extends this theme of unlikely alliance. But the film's midpoint, Dek is traveling with an android and a native creature, neither of which should theoretically be his ally. The found family structure, a phrase that's become somewhat cliched in discussing contemporary cinema, actually functions here because the film refuses the sentimental language typically attached to it. These aren't characters discovering they're a family in some emotional sense, they're survivors who need each other, and that pragmatism is far more affecting than forced catharsis would be. Cinematographer Jeff Cutter frames most of the film in wide shots that emphasize isolation and vastness. The landscape of Jenna, rendered through extensive visual effects work, has a barren, almost sculptural quality. It's not designed to overwhelm with spectacle, but to establish an environment where everything matters because there's nothing extraneous. The 2:39:1 aspect ratio elongates every frame, making the horizon feel simultaneously intimate and infinite. This is particularly effective in the quieter sequences when Dek is constructing weapons from organic materials or when he and Thea are simply moving through the terrain. The film's PG-13 rating occasionally feels like a constraint that Trachtenberg has actually worked into an aesthetic advantage. The action sequences lack the visceral gore that characterized earlier Predator films, yet they don't feel sanitized. When combat occurs, the emphasis falls on strategy and survival rather than bodily destruction. Deck weaponizes his environment, crafting tools from Jenna's flora and fauna. It's a choice that makes the protagonist feel resourceful rather than invincible, which subtly shifts how we perceive his journey. That said, the visual effects, while technically proficient, occasionally lack that memorable quality that might elevate the film beyond its functional effectiveness. Everything is clean, everything is polished. The Kalisk itself, revealed gradually throughout the film, is a genuinely unsettling creature design, but the moments of discovery feel slightly muted. A more aggressive color palette or a willingness to hold on the creature longer might have deepened the menace. Instead, the movie moves forward efficient and capable, but not quite as daring. Where Badlands reveals the tension between its commitment to simplicity and the demands of its $105 million studio picture is in its final act. The Weyland-Yutani Corporation arrives with personnel and resources, suddenly introducing the kind of external conflict that feels almost obligatory in blockbuster filmmaking. Tessa, Thea's synthetic sister, becomes a focal point of antagonism, and the narrative pivots towards a more traditional confrontation. This sequence is not poorly executed. The facility infiltration, the confrontation with Tessa in her mechanical power loader, the rescue of the Kalisk, these beats are handled with competence, but they also feel slightly redundant. The film has already established Deck's ingenuity and his willingness to prioritize Thea and Bud over his original mission. Adding external opposition feels less like an escalation and more like a contractual obligation, as if the narrative needs to hit a certain story beat to justify the budget and runtime. I didn't mind it though, it feels fine. The ending, which I won't fully detail for those still unspoiled, pulls back to a longer view. Jack returns to Yautja Prime with Thea and an older Bud. He confronts his father with his trophy, but also enacts a form of justice for his brother. The film then executes the contemporary blockbuster move of cutting to credits before continuing for an additional scene. A larger spaceship arrives, Jack reveals it contains his mother, and we cut to black. It's a setup for a sequel that feels more earned than most because the film has spent its runtime establishing relationship dynamics rather than mythology. We know why this moment matters because we've watched Deck navigate family betrayal and discover found family. A spaceship carrying his biological mother carries weight because we understand what family means to him now. What makes Predator Badlands distinctive is not that it succeeds at everything it does not, but that it succeeds precisely through its limitations. In an era where blockbusters are routinely asked to serve as universe-building exercises, and this film itself is part of a massive franchise and universe. When these movies are sometimes forced to be franchise cornerstones and also have emotional narratives at the same time, Trachtenberg has made a film that does one thing. It follows two unlikely companions on a survival mission and lets their relationship develop through proximity and necessity rather than contrived emotional beats. The script's refusal to explain itself is part of the strength. Deck's father kills his brother as punishment for defiance. This is presented without lengthy justification or backstory. It's simply how power operates in Predator society. Similarly, Thea's synthetic nature doesn't prompt lengthy philosophical discussions about consciousness or identity. She simply is, and the film moves forward. The economy of storytelling feels almost countercultural in contemporary cinema. The buddy dynamic between Deck and Thea works because it's built on the foundation of actual need rather than character arc necessity. Thea needs her legs, Deck needs guidance, tracking the Kalisk. From that practical foundation, something warmer emerges, but the film never pretends it's emerged from anything other than circumstance. When Thea says, "Was that a joke?" it's Deck's attempt at humor. The moment lands not because it's particularly funny, but because it is honest. They are different beings learning to coexist, and that learning process is genuinely interesting to watch because it's not narratively engineered to be touching. If Badlands occasionally feels slight, it's because Trachtenberg's directorial choices, while effective, are conservative. The score by Sarah Schrechner and Benjamin Wallfisch provides functional accompaniment, but rarely transcends into the memorable. Moments that might have benefited from musical weight pass by with modest underscore. The cinematography is crisp, but rarely ventures into visual boldness that might distinguish particular sequences from others. There's a competence to everything that verges on the anonymous. Comparing it to Prey, Trachtenberg's previous Predator film, Badlands feels a little less adventurous. I just think Prey had more because of more human characters, and the Predator was the villain in that movie. I'm not sure, this feels more of an experiment. I really did enjoy this film. Prey was set in a historical period and allowed its visual language to emerge from that specificity. The flora, the light, the color palette all carried weight because they were tied to a particular time and place. Badlands, despite its alien setting, feels more generic to me. The environment serves the story rather than informing it, and yet perhaps that's the point. Prey was about a specific cultural moment. Badlands is about isolation and survival in their purest forms. The genericness of the setting, a hostile planet stripped of unnecessary detail, becomes appropriate to the stripped-down narrative. Dec and Thea could be fighting for survival anywhere. The specifics of Jenna matter less than a fundamental human or predator-adjacent truth of their relationship. Predator Badlands opened to a franchise record of $40 million domestically and earned an A- on CinemaScore, the highest the series has ever received. Audiences clearly responded to what Trachtenberg was offering, a straightforward adventure that trusts its core dynamic and doesn't feel the need to justify itself through explanation or complication. The film's real accomplishment is demonstrating that large-scale filmmaking doesn't require narrative complexity to justify its budget. It requires clarity of vision and restraint. Trachtenberg has made a film that knows exactly what it is, a story about two unlikely companions helping each other survive, rendered with technical proficiency and visual confidence. It doesn't transcend its premise, but it doesn't need to. The premise, executed cleanly and without unnecessary flourish, provides sufficient. In an industry that constantly pushes toward elaboration, towards universe building and mythology expansion and character crossovers, Predator Badlands is valuable simply for asking, what if we just told a simple story well? The answer, it turns out, is refreshingly satisfying. Not because it's perfect, but because it understands its own limits and operates confidently within them. That's rarer than it should be.